Hello everyone, how are you? I hope you are doing well. So today in this video we are going to cover the analyses that were assigned for this week that are related to the week's topic, which is subjunctive mood. We have selected some sentences that in our opinion are the more important ones, the ones in which we will find discrepancies and differences. So let's start first with the sentence that is on page 126 from your handbook. Sentence A, may all the parties involved find a solution soon. The translation we have provided is que todas las partes involucradas encuentren pronto una solución. So, in the case of English, let's analyze first the instance in Spanish. In the case of Spanish, we have the verb encontrar conjugated in presente del subjuntivo. So, the first thing we have to do is to look for the verbs conjugated in subjunctive mood. So in this case, in Spanish, we have the verb encontrar conjugated in presente del subjuntivo. Encuentre. In this instance, it is also important to speak about the presence of the conjunction que. It would be incomplete only to make reference to the conjugated verb, because in this instance, this conjunction que is acting as índice de actitud or attitudinal index. This is terminology we have taken from Zorrilla 2007. You have that information on your handbook on page 127 that reads that in subjunctive mood can appear in independent sentences after adverbs or subordinating conjunctions that are called índices de actitud or attitudinal indexes that help denote the attitude of the speaker with respect to what they say. So in this case, it helps us denote this meaning or the expression of wish that is at stake. Why do I say that there is an expression of wish at stake? Because that is the meaning conveyed by the sentence. This, in the case of English, is expressed or is achieved by means of fronting a modal auxiliary. In this case, we will not find a verb conjugated in the subjunctive mood, but rather we see that the rendition in English is may all the parties involved find a solution soon. So the fronting of this modal auxiliary may has as effect or is associated with this expression of wish that I was referring to minutes ago in the case of Spanish. The fronting of this modal triggers subject-dependent inversion. So we see that we have may, all the parties involved, that is acting as subject, and then we have find. So that's why we speak of subject-dependent inversion. What you must remember is that in this case, what is under analysis is the whole verbal phrase, the whole verb phrase may find. So you cannot refer only to may alone, but rather to may find. So this is an instance of a modal construction that is made up of the modal auxiliary may plus the verb form of the verb find. What do we have already said that in Spanish we have an instance of a verb conjugated in the subjunctive mood, and we find that that the verb in the subjunctive mood is part of an independent sentence. So, in the case of Spanish, we can speak of subjuntivo, and we can classify the instance of subjunctive as subjuntivo optativo, following, just classification, the one that you have on your handbook as well. This would be then subjuntivo optativo, es decir, hace referencia a acciones necesarias o deseadas. So in this case, it would be una acción deseada. As you can see on the left, I did not include anything in relation to the type of subjunctive mood at stake, because there is no subjunctive, there is no verb in the subjunctive mood to speak about. So it would be incorrect to say, for example, that this is an instance of present subjunctive, because there is no verb in the subjunctive mood. But we must speak of modality, because we have identified that the instance in English is a modal construction, the instance under analysis may find. So, as this is a modal construction, we need to speak of the type of modality. Remember that we can classify, or modality can be divided into intrinsic and extrinsic. In this case, this is an instance of root or intrinsic modality, because the meaning at stake is that of the expression of a wish. We have already said that. With respect to Spanish, we need to speak of the temporal correlation. This is only for Spanish. This is material you have in RAE under chapter 24, that there is a temporal correlation between the tenses in the subjunctive mode and those in the indicative mode. Depending on the meaning conveyed, we can relate the tenses from one mood with the tenses from the other mood. So, in this case, as we have classified the verb encontrar as presente del subjuntivo, we see that if we classify the tense as presente del subjuntivo, the relation can be done with presente del indicativo or futuro simple o futuro, simplemente futuro del indicativo, depending on the meaning conveyed. So in this case, the temporal correlation with respect to the indicative mood would be that of futuro del modo indicativo. As regards the trigger, in this case, we speak of the trigger being a syntactic trigger. Sorry, there was a mistake as regards the identification of the trigger. In this case, we can say that the trigger is a semantic one. You will see in Natalia's videos that we can identify that the trigger, which is the trigger for the usage of the subjunctive mood. In this case, we can only speak of the trigger in Spanish, taking into account we have not identified any instance of subjunctive mood in English. So in Spanish, the trigger is going to be a semantic one, evidenced by the employment of this subordinating conjunction functioning as attitudinal index, which is que. The que we have identified previously. So in this pair, this is an instance of non-correspondence, since in English we have a modal construction, may find, whereas in Spanish we have a verb conjugated in a tense proper in the subjunctive mode. Let's move to the following sentence, which is sentence A from page 127. The original sentence is the one in English. The coach demands that the athlete stretch his or her muscles. Our rendition is: el entrenador o la entrenadora le exige al o a la atleta que estire o que elongue los músculos. Both versions, either estirar o elongar, are correct and can be used for the translation. So, what do we find in English? In English, we have the verb stretch in its base form. So, if we identify the verb in its base form, we are identifying the verb or this form as being conjugated in the subjunctive mode. In this instance, it's important to exemplify that this verb, the verb stretch, is part of a nominal that clause that comes after an expression of demand, which is included in the main clause. In this case, the expression of or the notion of demand is expressed in the verbal predicate, the verb demand. And in the case of Spanish, this notion of demand is expressed by the verbal predicate exigir. In the case of Spanish, we have the verb either estirar o elongar conjugated in presente del subjuntivo. Again, the same example. This verb is part of a nominal that clause. As I have said, the verbal predicate, which denotes a notion of demand, demand in English and exigir in Spanish, these verbal predicates are part of the main clause and are the ones that trigger the use of subjunctive mood in the subordinate clause. So, in this case, the verbs conjugated in the subjunctive mood are part of dependent clauses in both languages. In this specific example, we can identify the verb stretch as an instance of present subjunctive, mandative subjunctive. Whereas in Spanish, this is going to be an instance of subjuntivo optativo. We have said that this subjunctive form is within a dependent clause, so we can say that this is an instance of subjuntivo optativo in which the subjunctive mood, can be identified within a subordinate nominal clause that comes after the notion of command. I have repeated that part because I am taking the information you have on your handbook on page 123. Which is going to be the temporal correlation in relation to the tenses in the indicative mode? Well, the correlation is futuro simple as well. In this case, we can speak of the trigger being a syntactic one. In this very specific example, we can speak of the trigger in both languages because in both languages we have identified a verb conjugated in the subjunctive mode. So in this case, the trigger is syntactic, And the use of the subjunctive can be accounted for by the notion expressed by the verbal predicate in the independent clause. So this is an instance of correspondence in both languages, because we can identify the usage of a verb conjugated in the subjunctive mood in both languages. The following sentence is sentence F from page 127 that reads, if your father were more powerful, would you take advantage of it? Our translation was, si tu padre fuera más poderoso, ¿sacarías provecho de eso? In English, this is an instance of past subjunctive, or also known as were subjunctive. And I am quoting the information you have on your handbook. The past subjunctive or were subjunctive is hypothetical in meaning. We normally find the were subjunctive in conditional or concessive clauses, or in subordinate nominal clauses after the notion of wish and suppose. In the case of Spanish, we see that we have the verb ser conjugated in pretérito imperfecto del modo subjuntivo. If we were to, as we have to state the type of subjunctive, following Zorrilla's classification, this is going to be an instance of subjuntivo potencial. We can see that in both languages, the verb in the subjunctive mood is part of a dependent clause, and this dependent clause can be classified as a dependent clause of condition. This usage denotes an unreal situation in the present time frame. We can see that there is the expression of a hypothetical meaning. The temporal correlation in relation to the tenses in the indicative mood, we have identified the verb ser conjugated in pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo, and we have three possibilities, or we can relate the pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo with three different tenses in the indicative mode: pretérito perfecto simple, pretérito imperfecto, o condicional, depending on the meaning conveyed. In this case, we can relate the pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo with condicional del modo indicativo. As regards the trigger, we can say that in this case the trigger is a syntactic one, because the use of the subjunctive in this case is triggered because the verb is part of a subordinate conditional clause. Again, this is an instance of correspondence, because we have either in English and in Spanish verbs conjugated in the subjunctive mode. What about the following sentence? The following sentence is sentence G from page 128. If he should turn up, let me know at once. That is the original rendition. And the translation is, si apareciera, hágamelo saber de inmediato. So, what do we have in English? In English, we speak of an instance of putative should. This is the instance at stake. So, this is an instance of putative should. The putative should, as the material explains, conveys the notion of a situation that is recognized as possibly existing or possibly coming into existence. This putative should is a modal construction. A modal construction made up of the modal auxiliary should plus the bare form of the verb turn up. Whereas in Spanish we have si apareciera, hágamelo saber. So this is an instance of the verb aparecer conjugated in pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo, and it can be classified again as subjuntivo potencial. As we have identified in English, this is only for English, so I will sorry for the interruption. I wanted to change that from the chart because I don't want to confuse you. When we speak of modality, in the case of, in this example, we are only referring to English because we have identified putative should as an instance of a modal construction. Therefore, if this is a modal construction, we need to classify the type of modality. This is going to be epistemic modality because the meaning denoted is that of possibility. As we have said, this is the notion conveyed by putative should, a situation which is possibly existing or coming into existence. We can see that in both languages, the verb phrases at stake are part of subordinate clauses of condition, because there is this expression of possibility. In this example, we can speak of the trigger being both syntactic and semantic. Syntactic, because we have stated that the subjunctive mood is part of a specific subordinate clause of condition, and semantic because of the meaning conveyed, this meaning of possibility. Of a situation, possibly coming into existence. As regards the temporal value, we have identified the tense of aparecer as pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo, and we have said that pretérito imperfecto del subjuntivo can be correlated to three different tenses of the indicative mood: pretérito perfecto simple, pretérito imperfecto, o condicional. In this case, the relation is going to be with condicional of the indicative mode. This is an instance again of non-correspondence, because in English we have a modal construction, while in Spanish we have a verb conjugated in a tense proper in the subjunctive mode. Let's analyze the very last example. This is the last sentence on page 128. The original sentence reads: que baste con decir que nuestro equipo ganó todos los partidos. Our rendition was: suffice it to say that our team won all the matches. This is an instance of, in Spanish, of the verb bastar conjugated in presente del subjuntivo. As we did on the previous, on the first example, in this sentence, we need to classify not only, or to speak of, not only the type of verb and the tense and the mood in which it is conjugated, but also of importance is to include the fact that there is a conjunction, the conjunction que, acting as índice de actitud or attitudinal index that denotes the attitude of the speaker. As I have said before, this is Zorrilla 2007. And this is part of your handbooks as well. What do we have in English? In English, we have the verb suffice used, or the verb suffice in its base form. Let me add that, base form, used with a third person singular subject. So this can unequivocally be classified as an instance of subjunctive mode. In both languages, we see that the verb in the subjunctive mood is part of an independent clause. In the case of English, this is going to be suffice, is going to be an instance of present subjunctive, formulaic subjunctive. Please check the material, the reading material, because within subjunctive we can speak of present subjunctive and past subjunctive, and within present we can classify the instances as mandative or formulaic. So try to be as precise as possible. On the other hand, in the case of Spanish, we speak of a subjuntivo optativo. The trigger, we can speak of the trigger in this case in the case of Spanish, because in the case of English, suffice it to say, it's a fixed expression. That's why we classify the instance as formulaic subjunctive. But in the case of Spanish, what triggers the use of subjunctive mode is the presence of this attitudinal index, the presence of this subordinating conjunction acting as attitudinal index o índice de actitud. As regards the temporal value or the relation between the tenses in subjunctive with the tenses in the indicative mode, we have said that presente del subjuntivo can be related to either presente o futuro del modo indicativo. In this case, it can be the presente del subjuntivo can be related to futuro del modo indicativo. This example is an instance of correspondence, because we see then that both languages are making use of, or are in both languages we find verbs conjugated in the subjunctive mode. I hope I was clear and you were able to understand my directions. If not, as always, feel free to ask questions and to post your questions on the classroom, and we will answer them as soon as possible. Thank you very much.